Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Bright Blue's 12th panel event looking at the opportunity cost associated with the transition to net zero. My name is Alexandra Jezeph and I'm on the board of Bright Blue, an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. It has 7 major themes: a bountiful economy, clean environment, good lives, rewarding work, empowering government, just institutions and connected communities. A couple of housekeeping points to note. The event is being recorded and also live streamed via the Conservative Party's digital platform, so a warm welcome to our online audience. In hosting this event, we're very pleased to be partnering with KPMG, and if you're on Twitter, please do use hashtag BrightBlue and hashtag CPC21 for the event, and the Twitter handles are at WeAreBrightBlue and at KPMG UK. Around 70% of the world's economies are signed up to the net zero commitments, and more countries are expected to sign up ahead of COP6 in November, COP26. The aim is to be net zero by 2050 and keep global warming below 1.5 degrees as the world experiences ever more extreme weather events, whether that's fires in Australia or floods in New York, and the imperative is becoming ever more apparent. With the pledges made, the focus now needs to shift to implementation and delivery of the emissions reductions targets. And in the case of the UK, meeting the net zero carbon emissions by 2050 will require fundamental changes to all sectors in the UK economy, and quite probably the lifestyles of everyone in this room and beyond. And this means, amongst other things, that embracing new low-carbon technologies empower transport and industry, which in turn will require coordinated whole systems approaches, a clear policy framework and significant capital investment. So this afternoon's debate will examine where we are on this transition to net zero and the opportunities and challenges it presents. And we've asked our panellists to consider a number of questions, including how much of the responsibility for achieving net zero lies with government, businesses and individuals. How expensive is the transition to net zero likely to be? How prepared are businesses and consumers to take on additional costs to achieve net zero, and what role does the government have to help with them? And which sectors are likely to find this transition easiest and which are likely to need more support? We have given them more questions, but we'll pick those up in the at a later point. We are delighted to have our 4 panellists today. Gareth Davies, MP for Grantham and Stamford. He is also a member of the House of Commons Finance Select Committee. We have Stephen Bush, who is political editor of the new Statesman. Dr. Doug Parr, who is Chief Scientist and Policy Director at Greenpeace UK. And Simon Virley, who is Vice Chair and Head of Energy and Natural Resources at KPMG. So we've got just over an hour an hour and a half to cover a lot of ground. I will note that Gareth is with us for half an hour, so we'll invite him to speak first and then perhaps...
Yeah, we're a bit longer than that.
Oh, you're longer there. Okay, yeah. About an hour. Okay, that's much better. Yeah. Excellent. So Gareth, would you like to kick off the discussion?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to everybody. For those who don't know me, I got elected in December 2019. For so many conferences, I stood at the back of the room looking at events like this. I still can't quite believe that I'm at the front of the room right now in front of all of you, but I really appreciate your time and coming to this event on what is, frankly, one of the most important issues that we have to deal with in public policy today, and that is how we achieve the 2050 target that we've put in law. By the way, one of the biggest countries to do that, and we shouldn't forget that. That is a big commitment, and it will require a lot of change. What we have to agree on, though, is that this isn't a political issue. It shouldn't be a political football. This is something that we should all agree on as a human race, that we need to solve for the planet. And any politician that goes into public policy, into government, into the House of Commons, does so because they want to leave the country and the planet in a much better position than when they entered it. And that's no different for me. And so rest assured that me, my colleagues, the Prime Minister, this government are fully focused on achieving our 2050 ambitions. And the public, I think, are now very clear that action needs to be taken to address climate change. But I think what is not appreciated quite as much as perhaps it should be in public policy and in debate is that you can't just look at the government for all the answers. The government has a huge part to play, of course it does. But businesses must play a part and see this as an opportunity as much as it is a hindrance perhaps in the short term. Investors need to support those businesses, particularly those businesses that are innovating to meet these targets. And we as individuals also need to obviously play a part in our everyday lives. For me, one of the most exciting parts of this is around innovation and how technology will be able to harness this change and allow us as a country to meet the challenge of achieving net zero. And it's right that the government's role is to support that innovation as best we can. And for me, no doubt this will be a bit of a debate today, but for me, that's how the government can play the greatest role, to incentivise innovation to meet our challenge of achieving net zero. The last thing I will just point out that's been made many times before, for all of our efforts in this country, for all of our efforts in business and investments as individuals in this country, we still only emit 1% of the world's emissions. We can't do it alone as a country. And we need to do everything we can internationally to ensure that countries like China and India, the United States and others take our lead and either legislate to change their country towards net zero, or do whatever it takes within their own boundaries of activity to ensure that we as a planet are achieving net zero, so that the planet that our children inherit is better than it is today, it's cleaner than it is today. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Gareth. I think, yeah, we should all agree, but I'm not sure that we do, so we can bring that up for the questions and answer session. Incentivising innovation, you touched on there, and the role in influencing international response to climate change as well, so thank you very much. Stephen, did you want to continue?
Yeah, so thanks very much for having me on what's such an important debate. I think broadly I would agree with much of what Gareth has just said. And we see already how there are lots of things which are great about the net zero target, not least that it's something we urgently need to do, but it has already led to changes of behaviour among investors because people realise, oh, wait a second, very high carbon industries are not ones that should be part of my portfolio if I am a pension fund, for example, right? That is a really clear example of a government sending signals and creating the correct environment for businesses to innovate, change their approach. So a big part of the role of government is essentially making sure that the regulatory incentives are in place. And from that, much business and much individual behaviour change should take care of itself. There is, of course, a specific role for the role of government in driving specific modal shifts and specific changes of behaviour, and I imagine we'll get into that in the question and answers. But I specifically wanted to talk about the cost of net zero, which kind of feels like, as a party, there's a danger that the Conservatives then you enter this sort of false debate in which, for a lot of people, they talk about the cost because that's become the socially respectable way of saying they don't like this target and they would like it to go away, which means then people who would like the target to happen respond by saying, well, if you think the costs of this are high, you should wait till you see what the costs of flood damage are, which is true, but it avoids having an intelligent and important conversation about the fact that, for instance, if you do as many people in the government would like to, change the incentives around electric and gas heating, because at the moment it is slightly crazy how much more expensive it is to heat your house with gas. That still is quite a large upfront cost for households. And I think the thing we're blessed with in this country is that there is broad political consensus both within and between the major parties that this is a problem. We see that playing out, it's a small thing, but low traffic neighbourhoods, an initiative of the central government, largely taken on because of the type of neighbourhoods that most benefit from them by Labour and Liberal Democrat local authorities. And yes, there is some opportunism when the Lib Dems are in opposition, Labour in opposition, the Conservatives are in opposition locally in running against these things. But broadly, you see an important change in how we live and organise our neighbourhoods happening with the political parties working together. But I think it's really important that we have a very serious understanding of how much we are expecting individual households to pay. To refer to, of course, one of the many looming subplots outside this conference, right? Yes, the universal credit uplift was about the emergency conditions of the pandemic, but as we are over the next decade going to ask households to take on quite a lot of additional direct and indirect costs, some of the assumptions about the correct size of the safety net and the correct level of welfare to work initiatives are going to have to be revisited. And to do that, as well as that guiding role that government plays, there does have to be a serious fact-based and intelligent understanding of just how big the cost we are asking individuals to pay is, because otherwise we will lose that wonderful political situation we have in. You'll see, as we've seen in France, as we see in other parts of the world, where people at the bottom of the income distribution in particular start to turn against the target. It is vitally important that we maintain the political unity that we have around it, and that does involve making sure that the cost is not too much for individual households to bear, and that will involve a form of burden sharing.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen, for your comments there, focused mainly on the cost piece. Dr. Doug Parr, could I ask you to continue?
Sure. Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today about this. The situation we find ourselves in is that, particularly in the electricity, buildings and transport sector, that we need to make a transition at some speed, and by some speed I'm talking about the next couple of decades, to something approximating zero carbon across those sectors. And they're going to be joined up. You know, we're going to find a lot of electricity is providing motive power. Electricity is going to be providing heating for buildings. It has to be done at speed, and we have a set of technologies today which we can roll out. There may be others. You know, we can provide innovation. That's great. But we also need to get on with it. We've already got a set of pretty challenging targets for 2030, and we're not on track for those. I want to make 4 points briefly in each case. Firstly, where is public opinion? Does public opinion provide a bar to this transition? The answer is an emphatic no. The need for climate action, or the need for government to prioritise climate action more, is actually widespread throughout the population, including the red wall seats. It does not in itself provide a bar to that, and across all demographics. It's true for curiously, it's amongst the young and the old. The sort of middle-aged people, there's a little drop, but not a substantial drop. You know, we're not talking a big deal. But the idea that the old people are anti this transition is just completely wrong. The second point is about fairness, and I just want to put out a shout out, because Stephen's already mentioned it, because we're very lucky in this country. Climate is not like it is in America. It's not like it is in Canada. It's not like it is in Australia, where it is a divisive political issue. And some people on the Conservative side have put a lot of time and effort into keeping that, and they deserve a lot of praise, because that allows us to have the kind of conversations that actually get to the meat of this, and not the kind of divisive ones that you can see going on in a Trumpian America. So, you know who you are. Thank you very much. But fairness is absolutely critical to this transition. If you look at the support for it, if fairness is not embedded within the transition, this comes out through all kinds of focus groups, very strong within the Climate Assembly is one of their key principles. If that's not embedded in the way the policies are enacted, then they will run into trouble. And you can see that with the way some people feel that they've been unfairly treated in low traffic neighbourhoods. I'm not saying whether they have or they haven't, but that's how they feel. Thirdly, I don't think we should be put off the transition by worries over the level of behaviour change that people need to engage in. this thing has changed my behaviour, unbelievably so. Back in the day when I would come for a conference, you were basically incommunicado for a long time. Now you can, probably especially when I'm speaking, can send an email from the back of the room, right? You can be in touch with your office. I sat next to a guy who was on a Teams meeting when I was having coffee this morning. He was pissed off about it, but he's still connected to the office, and that's, behaviour has completely changed. It was underway before COVID. You can see the same thing with the way people change their behaviour when they have electric vehicles. They can accommodate the different kinds of motive power and the different ways of having that, such that 9 out of 10 EV drivers say they'd never want to go back. They're perfectly happy with the way in which it's possible to recharge an electric vehicle. I'm not saying there aren't infrastructure challenges or those without off-street parking, none of that, but we should not be afraid of this. And the final point I would say is there are yes, we're obliged to make the transition, but there are massive opportunities to come with it too. We should take this opportunity to fairly upgrade Britain's housing so that we're not stuck with the worst housing stock in Western Europe, which is where we are at the moment, with the NHS shouldering between 1.4 and £2 billion a year on costs arising from poor housing, people in cold homes. And mouldy homes, particularly damp ones. So there are opportunities with that, because what comes with that is jobs throughout the regions. It's a major infrastructure problem. It's just one example, and there are others in electric vehicles, in industry, where genuinely we could take some kind of leadership position. I fear already that our potential leadership position on green hydrogen could be slipping away. So as part of this, we do think that this next spending review does need to commit around 25 billion a year into the green transition, which covers nature restoration and transport. And that sounds a lot, and it is a lot. But that's the sort of level that is commensurate with the scale of the challenge that we need to meet. And in the Chancellor's speech in the auditorium, if you heard it, it was full of references to the importance of being fair to future generations. I think climate fits extremely well into that, and I hope he had that in mind, even if he didn't mention it, as part of the things that this government needs to tackle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parr. Covering a range of comments there. Public opinion, fairness, behaviour changes, the urgent need for upgrading the UK housing stock. Simon, over to you.
Thanks very much, and good to be with you. I'm going to speak pretty much from a business perspective, because I spend my life advising companies on the energy transition across the whole of the energy sector. So just 5 points from me. I think we should be rightly proud about the UK's record in terms of decarbonisation. We are halfway to net zero. We should just remind ourselves of how far we have come over the past 30 years. Of course, it's going to get harder now, and we're going to get into the more difficult sectors. Doug's already mentioned homes and buildings. I think hydrogen, carbon capture are all challenges ahead, but we should take some heart from what we've achieved in other areas like offshore wind, where we provided a clear policy framework and business stepped up to the plate, to your point, Gareth. So I think that investors are ready to invest if we can get those long-term policy frameworks in place. There is a wall of capital out there ready for green investment. And what we need to do is focus on delivery and execution now. The targets are great, the ambition's great, the direction of travel is clear. And I think it's great that we've got a political consensus around this, but we do now need to focus on execution and on delivery in those other sectors. Second point, I totally agree with what Stephen and Doug have said about engaging with the public. I think we need a proper debate. We need a proper widespread debate at national and local level. I'm a great believer that the solutions to our decarbonisation of homes and buildings are all going to be local in nature. They're going to depend on the property type in your area, your gas, your electricity connections. We need that debate to be happening at all levels. I know Guy's in the audience been a proponent of this. But local area energy planning, like the sort we've had in Manchester, actually has got a really important role to play around the country as we basically make communities part of the solutions here in terms of what's going to work in their area. Third point, and this is rather a business point, don't underestimate the importance of climate risk disclosures, the so-called TCFD agenda. For my clients, the bigger clients, this is hugely important. And for me, in the next few weeks, what Mark Carney does in terms of hopefully getting agreement globally, starting with the G20, but moving on to global standards in terms of climate risk disclosures is massively important. The more transparency we can give investors about the credibility of company plans, the sharper the incentives will be to move away from fossil fuels and move into low carbon areas of the economy. And that is already biting in some parts of the economy, and I think London and the UK as a whole has got a massive role to play there as the centre of green finance and carbon markets, and leading the way, the UK leading the way in terms of that climate risk disclosure agenda. Fourthly, I would argue we need to set our energy system up in the right way in institutional terms for net zero. 30 years ago, we took the lead in terms of privatising our energy sector. We now need to get the institutions right for net zero delivery. And I've argued that the taking the system operator out of National Grid is the start, perhaps, of a body that could provide that deep expertise in terms of the systems thinking that's required across the energy system now. I think I would draw out that perhaps the need for systems thinking in our energy system has never been greater, but the bandwidth to do it in Whitehall has perhaps never been smaller than it is today. So I think, a bit like the Bank of England was given the task of running monetary policy, I personally think we need an institution with a depth of expertise to provide that energy systems thinking if we're to get there. And finally, we need a much greater focus on adaptation, because whatever happens at COP26, we're all going to be facing a change in climate. We've already seen the dramatic impacts at just 1 degree above pre-industrial levels. So we need to shift the balance. We always talk about mitigation at events like this. We always focus our resources many more times go into mitigation than they do into adaptation in the UK. We need to shift that balance because we are going to be facing more extreme weather. So I'll leave my comments there. In answer to your first question, of course, it's the responsibility of all of us, business, government and individuals. I'm sure we'd hopefully all agree on that.
I thought you might say that. Thanks very much, Simon. Covering there the UK's record, the need for a local response, the risk factor, the institutional setup for net zero delivery being important, and adaptation, as you finished there as well. That concludes our speakers' introductions. If you have any questions, I'll turn to the floor now. We do have a roving mic, so if you do have a question, please just raise your hand and we will come to you straight away. There's a gentleman in the corner, and just as the mic is finding its way to you, I'm going to open with a quick question back to Gareth. I understand you've been sort of involved on the green bonds and green finance piece, which hasn't got a mention yet. Could you give us a bit of a commentary about what your thinking is on the role of that as well? So
yeah, thank you very much. I should have mentioned, actually, I completely omitted to say that before politics, I was in financial services, and in the last part of my career, dedicated my time to running an ESG business, which is a responsible investment business. And we were one of the largest in the City of London. We had about 32 billion and 16 analysts. And it used to drive me absolutely bonkers, quite frankly, that we would invest millions of pension fund assets in other countries' green debt, but not our own. It would drive me crazy that we would invest in bonds issued by KfW, which is the German infrastructure bank or development bank, that has helped really fund a lot of the renewable energy in Germany. 50%, I think, has been funded by KfW, but we didn't have our own. And so one of the first things I did when I got into Parliament was start raising this in a much more vigorous way, with a bit more of a spotlight, to try and persuade the Treasury to issue a Green Gilt. Now, we've just had that first tranche, that first issuance, which was a 10 billion green bond that was issued a couple of weeks ago. But what was really interesting was the first hour of trading saw £90 billion of demand from across the world. And this is coming from institutions, it's coming from pension funds and other investors. But it just shows the level of demand. And for anybody that's not sure what a green bond is, a green bond is essentially a normal bond, so essentially a loan by the government. But it's what they call hypothecated, so it's the use of proceeds are ring-fenced only for things that will move the needle in terms of green technology, green job creation, whatever. Helps achieve net zero. And why that's important is because, well, first of all, the Treasury's not done that before, other than the war loan to help pay for the Second World War. But it's really important because it does ring-fence spending, significant spending, 10 billion straight out the gate. We're going to get another tranche coming later this year. So that's really important. And the second thing, just very briefly, I mentioned KfW, which is the German development bank. In launching the National Infrastructure Bank, this will have a fundamental impact at mobilizing private capital. So a lot of the discussion and debate about how we pay for stuff, whether it's levelling up or climate change or whatever, is all about how much taxpayer money should we spend. But actually not enough discussion is going on about how much private capital is already there, patient capital held in pension funds, in sovereign wealth funds and the like. How we can better tap that, how we can mobilize that capital so that we have less taxpayer money going out the door every year and racking up the debt, so that when interest rates go up, we're paying more in servicing that debt. And the National Infrastructure Bank will mobilise multiples of the £12 billion that the Chancellor has put in to setting up that bank. And so I'm very optimistic that we can make fundamental structural changes to how our economy is mobilising that private capital so that you, the taxpayer, me, the taxpayer, doesn't have to pay as much towards the challenges that we face together.
Excellent. Thanks very much for giving us that overview, Gareth. I'll go straight to the floor then with questions. There was a gentleman at the back who, there we go, mic is on the way. Thanks very much. Do introduce yourself as well.
Hi, Tom Sass from the Institute for Government. Just a question on the role of the Treasury. We've argued in our work that, getting all of this right around the costs, the distributional consequences and so on, actually going to require quite a change of mindset within the Treasury, particularly if you look at their record over the last decade or two. I just wonder if the panel feel like that is happening in the Treasury at the moment. We've got a Chancellor who, as one of them referred to, sort of doesn't particularly like to mention climate change. We've got a Treasury sort of costs review which has been delayed by as much of a year. And if they do think it's changing, what are you looking out for in the budget, the spending review, the Treasury net zero review that would sort of be a sign of the Treasury coming on board for this transition?
Lovely, thanks very much. Do we have any other questions in the room while we're at it? Yes, gentleman at the front here.
Thanks. George Crozier, I work for the Chartered Institute of Taxation. I wondered what the panel thought was how big a role they see for carbon pricing in shifting both public and business behaviour in relation to the environment. The UK government has chosen to go for a UK emissions trading scheme over, for example, a unitary carbon tax. And I just wondered if the panellists think that it's robust and will be effective enough in its current state, or if it needs higher prices, extended scope, and so on.
Okay, thanks very much. Role of Treasury, that might be best placed with you, Gareth, if you wanted to give up.
Yeah, look, I'm always perplexed when I hear comments like that criticising the Treasury for not getting on board with the transition. I think they would robustly defend their actions and the series of announcements, two of which I've just mentioned. Tens of billions of pounds of capital going in the right direction on this. But I actually want to pick up on something Simon said, because it isn't often appreciated, this, but some of the moves that the Treasury and actually other departments have made on TCFD is a significant event, right? It is a significant development for disclosures in investments, because our pension fund system alone in the UK has about 2.3 trillion. And the way in which we're now going to be able to understand where that money is and where that money is going, if like's a good disinfectant, TCFD's a great answer to help, again, mobilise some of that capital. And again, Treasury, this Chancellor's fully behind that. In terms of the costings, I think they are very clear that because some of the inventions that need to take place haven't happened yet, it is very hard to put a marker down on how much net zero is going to cost, genuinely. If you take, for example, cement, I understand that cement contributes about 3% a year to emissions, but I haven't heard a solution yet as to what's going to replace that or how that becomes cleaner. And so if you can't do that, how can you put a definitive figure on how much is needed? Of course, we can have ballparks and that sort of thing. Maybe a panelist has got a better answer than I have on this. But as a finance guy, as a numbers guy, I find that hard to come up with a figure, frankly.
Thanks, Gareth. In terms of the carbon pricing piece, perhaps, Simon, I could look to you for the business response. But before you answer that, can I just ask for a clarification on TFCDs?
TCFDs?
TCFDs, there you go.
TCFDs. So, Task Force on Climate-Related Risk Disclosures, now mandatory for all large listed companies in the UK, will be required for all companies in the UK by 2025. I think Gareth's absolutely right. I think the Treasury deserve a lot of credit for that. Government deserves a lot of credit for taking the lead on that. A number of other countries are moving in the same direction. I was sat next to Mark Carney a few weeks ago. He told me he was confident he's going to get global standards agreed by this time next year. So that shining that light in terms of companies having to report on their climate risk disclosures is absolutely critical to giving investors the information they need. Building on what Gareth said on the Treasury, so I think they deserve credit there and credit on the green bond. Things I'm looking out for in the spending review, heat and building strategy would be nice because that is the key nut to crack, and some real clarity about the long-term framework, including when are gas boilers going to go. I saw there's a bus saying hands off on our gas boilers running around Manchester today. So we need some clarity about that in terms of the direction of travel there. And we should, as I say, take some inspiration about what happened on offshore wind. If you give the long-term clarity, you can get the cost down, and innovation will help get that cost down. Carbon capture and storage, I'd love to see the first 2 CCS clusters announced. That would be another great step forward, and of course the cost of net zero review. And on carbon prices, I used to be in charge of carbon taxes at the Treasury. I think carbon taxation has a really important role to play. It's a necessary, but I wouldn't say sufficient condition. Because why? Because inevitably chancellors need to have some freedom of manoeuvre when it comes to raising money, and taxes change year in, year out. So that's why I would argue that long-term regulatory mechanisms like the contract for difference for offshore wind can provide the sort of certainty that investors require. I would advocate, obviously, clearer carbon price signals as part of the solution, but I don't think it's for the business community who can just say, give us a carbon price and that's it. I don't think it's a sufficient condition for what's needed.
Thank you. Stephen and Doug, did you want to comment on either of those points around cost and pricing and Treasury, or happy to open to next questions?
Well, let me just say a little bit about the Treasury. There is a process going on that's been referred to called it's actually called the Net Zero Review, which isn't really very illuminating. You're probably familiar with it, but that is to look at, it was something that the Climate Change Committee said the Treasury should do, to look at the distributional, so brackets, fairness issues around the transition to net zero right across the economy. Now, for institutional reasons, that review has been partitioned off from day-to-day decisions about policy and spend that the Treasury has, and yet, for me, if that review that is going to come up with in its interim form came up with some high-level principles, can't actually inform the day-to-day activities of what the Treasury does, then you're sort of separating out something and creating a problem. And my hope was that that net zero review would be, it'd be like a mission statement. In other words, it's not the actual form of words you come up with, it's actually engaging people in the process around it so that everybody understands what needs to happen. And at this point, it's actually really hard to know whether that's happened inside the Treasury or whether this has actually been a little team working on its own and coming up with high-level principles which actually will sit on a shelf and be widely ignored. So at this point, I can't tell. Maybe others here on the panel can tell. But it feels to me like the delay and the separation are minimising its potential impact rather than maximising it. Which is where we need to be. We need to have fairness written into the centre of the policies as they're designed when they are, in terms of their distributional impacts. Otherwise, there is a danger that we will run foul of the sort of troublemaking that is going around on a bus today.
Thanks very much, Doug. Should we open again to some more questions? Any further questions in the room? Gentleman at the front here.
Cheers. Hi, everyone. Josh Buckland from Flint Global. And just on the Treasury point, I used to work in the Treasury, and I can say they are taking it quite seriously. The challenge they've got, obviously, is inevitably they've got a lot of other things to worry about as well. Just on the, obviously very interested in the cost point, does the panel think that the current gas price crisis and the challenges around affordability that we're going to face across the economy, especially for those on low incomes over the next 6 to 12 months, make it more difficult for government to make progress on the net zero agenda? And even if the answer to the question is no, does it teach the government anything around how they approach this issue from a cost and fairness perspective going forward?
Thank you. And I'll take a second question. I think there was a gentleman at the front here as well. Thanks very much.
No, I was just going to say, Doug, one of the panel members said that we're already halfway to net zero. Is that something that you, as chief scientist, that you would agree with, or
50% cut or so on 1990? I think in 2020 figures.
Or is there more
around that?
More room to go?
Oh well, we've done the easy bit. This is where it gets a bit tougher. There is still a bit of low-hanging fruit, but it's around, and I've talked about it before, it's the energy efficiency stuff, but we're starting to run into the trickiest stuff. That said, 5-6 years ago, you'd have said transport decarbonisation is going to be really, really hard, and now actually, not so much. A fundamentally renewable-led electricity system would be really, really expensive, you'd have said 10 years ago, and now probably cheaper than the fossil fuel equivalent. So, these things change over time.
The question on cost, Gareth, did you want to sort of pick up on that in terms of the gas price crisis and lessons learned?
Yeah, I think it was more on the cost of living and people's incomes, and I think it's a fair point. We've got to be mindful that we've got to bring people with us, and if they're noticing a massive impact in their pockets, then obviously that's harder, right? So one thing I would just point out there, as somebody that represents quite a rural constituency, this is not always appreciated in London, but you need a car to get around in my part of the world. I mean, I had my car in the garage not so long ago, as the guy at the back will tell you, and I was so dependent on him to get me around because there's no buses really, and it's just a reality of life in rural parts of this country, and we need to be mindful of that. When I ask my local councillors, what can we do to have more charging points so that we can have more electric cars and things like that, they constantly talk about there's not enough power on the grid. And I really need to study this, because if that's true and we need to get more power on the grid, then we need to do something about that, because you're not going to have the electric vehicles in rural parts of Lincolnshire ever if there's nothing to power them. So I would love to hear, perhaps the professor can give his view on that aspect, because I keep hearing this time and time again, there's not enough power on the grid, and I want to hear how we can tackle that. Clearly for the government, electric vehicles are really expensive right now, just to take that example again, and the government can play a role in that aspect of our transition. But I did note, just coming here to carry on the theme of this not being a political issue. Tony Blair came out with some very interesting comments recently, and he was on the cost of living aspect to this and net zero, and that was that, you know, he doesn't believe that, you know, we should implement measures that have a massive impact, a material impact on people's wallets. If we can just get people to, for example, cut car journeys by 4%, if we can get people to stop flying, you know, reduce flying by 6% a year, those kind of examples, just, you know, cutting little things like that over a long period of time will have a material impact. So it is right that we have this debate. It's right that we're talking about it cross-party. But I would love an answer to that national grid issue, that power on the grid issue, because that is something I would love to sort out in my patch.
I'm going to deflect that to Guy over there, who's done more energy systems modelling than I've done in my life in the last few years. So go on, Guy, you tell.
If we'll grab you a mic. Nothing like being put on the spot.
Thanks. So I'm Guy New. I'm from the Energy Systems Catapult. So we help innovators who are trying to take advantage of the transition, but we also think about how the system's actually going to work. And there's absolutely no reason that the electricity, zero carbon electricity system can't work in the same way. And that's about, you know, whether you have a very windy system with lots of hydrogen power backup, or you have nuclear power or CCUS or whatever. There's certainly a way. But the bigger challenge, you're absolutely right, Gareth, is probably actually at a local level. Particularly, you know, if everyone in the cul-de-sac or everyone in the village gets an EV at the same time and a heat pump, we don't actually have good visibility about what's going on at the local level in networks. So again, totally, there's no reason at all that it can't work. There's lots of spare capacity in some parts of the country, but we need a local approach. Back to one of the points that Simon approached, you need to understand the state of the building stock in a local area. You need to understand the state of the electricity grid, the gas grid, and right now we don't have any mechanism for doing that.
Simon, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just want to come back to Josh's question about does it make it more difficult? I'm really encouraged by hearing the Prime Minister say the long term, the right response to this is to actually double down in terms of net zero and actually reduce our dependency on the growing dependency on imported fossil fuels. Of course, that's not an answer in the short term. And obviously the short-term politics do get more difficult every time there is an increase in energy prices, no doubt about that. But my, you know, plea would be for everybody to hold their nerve through this and actually continue the course that we've set, and then you reap the benefits. If we can continue with a consistent direction, we'll reap the benefits in terms of the supply chain. And I think we've got to obviously make sure we're looking after customers in the short term and consumers, particularly the fuel poor, but help with this transition and, you know, not back off. I think it would be a great shame if we see politicians of whatever persuasion backing off net zero as a result of this short-term crisis.
Thanks, Simon. I'd like to pick up a question sort of that follows from this theme, and that's around energy security. So if our homes are powered by electricity at the moment, cars by petrol and cooking on gas, if we're moving to a sort of an electricity-focused supply, does that present security issues? Should we be actively seeking a sort of a more diverse sort of range of options? And I note you mentioned hydrogen earlier. Would you have any comments on that as well?
Yeah, personally, I think there's great merits in having a diverse range of energy sources. I really do. I don't think you want to have all your eggs in one basket when it comes to sources of energy. And particularly when you've got more and more extreme weather, which we need to plan for, you know, you don't want to have everything on one source. So we've also done extensive work on Britain's housing stock, and there are only a certain number of properties that will ever be suitable for a heat pump in this country. So, you know, we're going to need... I get a bit tired when I see the Twitter debate raging about is it heat pumps or hydrogen. The answer is clearly both. And it's clearly going to be local solutions depending on which part of the country you're in. Are you anywhere near the gas grid? Are you anywhere near an industrial cluster that's converting to hydrogen? You know, are you a new build? Are you an old property that hasn't got thermal, you know, the thermal efficiency to have a heat pump? Or maybe you're in a flat that doesn't have the space. So we just got to get this down to a granular level. And that's why I very much support what Guy was saying about the importance of local area energy planning. I think the government's hydrogen strategy, again, ambition, you know, to have about a third of our energy coming from hydrogen by 2050, you know, tremendous. The devil now is in the detail. Let's now see the business model that gives, you know, investors the clarity to then go and make those investments. We can have the first hydrogen town up and running in this country, you know, within the next 2 or 3 years, if we crack on. Many other countries around the world are. So hydrogen's a big part of the future in my view.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go to next round of questions, I think. Gentleman in the middle there. Any others while I'm thinking about it?
Hi, James Close from NatWest Group. We're into a global competition for capital here, and I wonder what the panel think are the main things that can make the UK most attractive for financing the net zero transition, and how to continue to build the business case through a lower cost of capital.
Okay, cost of capital question, and then back to Guy at the front here.
Thanks very much. So my question is about, lots of you talked about the importance of the political consensus, how important, but I'd like to push you a bit further on what you think could break it, both on the right and on the left. Where is it most vulnerable, and where do politicians reflecting consumers' concerns and people's concern actually go, sod this, this is too much?
Thanks very much. Gareth, did you want to field that one first off, and then perhaps Doug as well, and Stephen? Yeah.
Would love to do the NatWest one as well at some
point.
point.
Yeah, sorry, of course, yeah, either one. Go for whichever.
So just great to see you. One of the things I think we do need a better appreciation of is, again, back to the theme about investments. You're totally right. We can have this as an opportunity in this country. The City of London can harness, you know, the transition, the efforts that are already being made by financial services companies in this area. Of course, could do more in their own business operations, but in terms of TCFD and other things like that, I think we're making great progress. One point I would like to just stress, though, in every country, in every year that it's ever been tried, divestment hasn't changed the thing that is being sought to be changed. It hasn't. It hasn't affected anything like what they intended when they started divesting as institutional investors. So in the United States, when they started divesting Smith & Wesson and gun companies, people still, I think there's more guns in America today than there's ever been. When organizations divested tobacco, people still smoke, and it hasn't really had a material impact on the cost of capital of the businesses like Philip Morris and others. It is the market that changes these organisations, not through divestment. And I just want to make that point very clearly, because there is inevitably there will be a discussion among people's own personal savings, but also their pensions and those who look after their money. Divestment is not the way to do it. And this panel is about the cost, you know, opportunity cost of net zero. It will cost you money to divest, and it will not achieve the change that we need. The way you create change is through engagement, by being in the room, by having a seat at the table with the management of companies to talk, you know, to work with them on a transition. And I think that's really important and underplayed in public policy. Final thing, just on what could break it. One of the things that could break the agenda and public perception and support for this is if it becomes a bit like a Christmas tree and we start adding baubles to it. We have a very clear target and a very clear mission here, and that is to reduce our net emissions. The moment you start talking about, you know, I think somebody's coined the phrase the just transition, which is essentially a series of policies to institute bigger state, to institute less power at an individual level. That's when people start to slightly glaze over, and I think that's what I would worry about, particularly in some of the areas that the Conservative Party just won. That's what I worry about. Let's stay focused on what this is about, and that is achieving net zero.
Stephen, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, so I think on the left, the underlying risks to that consensus are about jobs and job losses. I imagine most of you were not paying that much attention to what was going on at Labour Party conference last week because you would have better things to do with your time. But one of the underlying subplots is the GMB, one of the largest affiliated trade unions, has quite a lot of concerns about Labour's green policies, not least because the B does stand for Boilermakers, so you know they obviously do have some interest in the future of that industry, and they obviously have a considerable interest in the future of nuclear power. Now that can, obviously at the moment that kind of doesn't matter. It doesn't look likely that Labour will be making important decisions about our transition in the immediate future. But yeah, the potential for the politics around job losses to cause fractures on the left is very real. That also is actually true on the right. I completely agree that there's a danger to making this sort of Christmas tree of we need to do this but equally there does also need to be an appreciation of the fact that we are asking households to make quite one of the things which is fascinating is there is no other political project this big and this deep where the government would not be insisting that every MP had to have an electric car, or the equivalent of it, right? If the government were closing every private school, right, Conservative MPs would not be allowed to send their children to private schools for the duration of the period that they were being managed into decline. Why aren't Conservative MPs being forced to buy electric cars? Because actually, the average backbencher, an electric car is still quite a big investment. So yes, there are things you can do in terms of creating the right regulatory environment to get the costs down. I think one of the things I think it's really important that every political actor reminds people that yes, it's true that we have done the easy stuff, but that's the other danger is climate despair, right? People forget, look, we have done 50% of this. There are private eye headlines about the coalition wasting money on the wind power price, which if I worked for that magazine, I wouldn't like to be reminded of. I don't know. I mean, anyone who's worked at a magazine and told them in a month, there are things they wouldn't like to be reminded of. So I don't know why I've decided to open that particular front. But I think it is really important that while really, particularly I think the lesson for the Conservatives is the success politically of the years of spending cuts, right? Where the priority wasn't how do we do spending cuts and this will make us be elected. It was how do we stay in power while doing this thing we believe to be absolutely necessary. And I think it is making sure that governments don't take their eyes off the prize, right? This is the most important thing governments around the world will do, particularly because the Conservative Party is a world leader on the centre-right. One of the most important things the Conservatives will do is demonstrating that you can do this without it being... Right, what would be the thing which would unlock the Republican Party having a saner position, or unlock... It's showing that you can do this in a way that leaves the world safe for centre-right ideas. And so it is really important to keep your eyes on that prize of doing this and keeping in power, which is why I agree that the just transition stuff risks taking a Christmas tree, but not focusing on the cost of reimbursing some of the losers does also risk destroying the very valuable political consensus we have.
Okay, thank you for that. Before I go to Simon, I'm just conscious of time. So Gareth, thank you very much for joining us. I'll now pass over to Simon.
I'm very grateful for everybody's contribution. Thank you.
Thanks, Gareth.
I just want to... Just want to come back to James's question just about the cost of capital, because a number of people in this room will remember back in 2013 we set a target for the cost of offshore wind at £100 a megawatt hour, and we smashed it. We ended up with costs at £40 a megawatt hour. Why? Because we had a clear long-term policy framework and a clear funding stream in the form of the auctions, and investors were able to plan with certainty, and the cost of capital came tumbling down. And so I just think that's the model, James, for when we think about hydrogen, we think about carbon capture, we think about homes and buildings. I mean, I just hope that the government doesn't fudge it when it comes to the wording in the forthcoming homes and building strategy. Let's be clear. Let's be clear with the market. The market now knows that electric vehicles are the way forward for passenger cars because they've banned petrol and diesel car sales. Let's be clear about the transition away from gas boilers and give plenty of time to make that transition and start with the low-hanging fruit in the easy places. That's the way to get the costs down and to ultimately save us all the costs and maximise the supply chain benefit in the process. So that would be my recommendation.
And just to build on that, if you could lower the cost of capital, you turn a capital cost into a reduced operating cost, and the net cost is much lower, and that's the role that banks and lenders and financiers can play in managing the transition. So those policy signals are absolutely at the heart of this.
Fully agree.
Lovely. Any more questions in the room? Yep, 2 more at the front here, and I've got a number coming through online as well. So,
thank you very much. Can I just ask, how do you react to Greta Thunberg's comment that the UK government specifically is talking a load of blah blah blah, and that actually we're nowhere near 50% reduction towards net zero?
okay.
Who's talking with forked tongue?
And we'll take another question before we open that.
Thank you. Michael Gibbons, Chairman of Elexon. We do the central systems in the wholesale market, electricity, CFDs, capacity mechanism, and market-wide half-hourly settlement, which I think is very important and not mentioned yet in the context of a much smarter system and reducing emissions. I wanted to go back right the way to Josh's question about the effect of the current so-called crisis, and in particular rising gas prices. Because what's happened is that the number of suppliers has decreased quite a lot. And with that, the potential, I guess, for the innovation that they might have brought. Arguable whether they would have done, but nevertheless, there's a lot less potential for that than there would have been. But what we're seeing as a consequence is the extreme sensitivity of the public to energy prices and electricity prices in particular. With prices in the electricity market currently, well, in November, December, forward prices, £258 per megawatt hour on average.
Okay.
That's roughly 5 times what it was just a year ago. So my question, I think particularly to Doug, but also to Simon and the rest of the panel, is given that huge sensitivity, and given, yes, Doug, the undoubted truth of the message that the public in general is with this policy, all of us are, but when you say to the public, if you go to a heat pump, you're going to have to pay more. The financial case, I just can't work out.
Okay. Yep.
So that's the question. How do you square the financial challenge, in particular of heat pumps, which is the biggest single problem for net zero in buildings as I see it?
Thank you very much. Okay. Doug, that seemed to be squarely sent your way.
Yeah.
We'll come to the rest of the panel as well.
Sure. So there's no question about the capital costs. We, along with many others, including CBI, E.ON and so on, have signed up to the Fair Heat Deal, which says that the capital costs for low-income families should be fully covered by essentially borrowing by government. I would say you could actually do some cleverer stuff with zero interest loans like they do in Germany with KfW, which has already been referred to. But fundamentally, if you have to do that transition, then you have to make that kind of investment, and you also have to give support to be able to pay at some level. Now, the thing about heat pumps is, what's the cost trajectory? And Simon's quite rightly talked a lot about offshore wind. Not everything is going to follow an offshore wind trajectory, because the thing about offshore wind and indeed solar is that they are or the turbines for wind anyway, they're modular, they're mass produced. You can do repetitive manufacturing that brings down the costs. If you're looking at 2 or 3 things that are big scale infrastructure, you don't get that. But heat pumps are more like solar than they are like, say, a nuclear power station. So there are players in the industry who are very optimistic and very bullish about how fast they can bring down those costs, and therefore a little bit of support at the top is not going to be quite so expensive as it might look. Basically, they're disagreeing with the projections that the CCC are putting forward. Now, it's an industry claim at this point. They also claim that they are going to be able to do almost every house with a heat pump in due course as they solve the various issues that they have in their application. Do we know they're going to do that? No, we don't. In terms of getting things moving, though, we do need a very different framework to the one that we've got. I've mentioned the Fair Heat Deal. It needs to go alongside in most cases, some kind of energy efficiency to make the low pump temperatures work better. And it needs to be recognised that as an infrastructure transition, you might need to borrow to make it happen. And that might be uncomfortable, but I don't see any other option, to be honest, because if you go down the hydrogen route, for example, I mean, you're using something like 3 times the amount of gas. So back to your first point about the cost of gas. It'd be as much directed at me as anybody. So it may seem a bit odd, but I think it's about how you count. Greta is looking at kind of global footprint. And for good and valid reasons, the way the international community has decided to count emissions is to say what happens within your territorial area, what happens within the UK, and all the emissions that go on within the UK are the ones you count. And those are, from last year, I mean, they're I don't know the exact number, but it is about 50% down. If you look at the footprint, I think the last figures that I saw they were about 15% down, because from 1990, a lot of our manufacturing is now done in China. We import a load of stuff that is cutting down rainforests in order to feed our animals, and inducing land use change elsewhere. And that's very hard to quantify, but it's definitely there. So if you count it, it doesn't look anything like as impressive. And remember, her standard is not, are we leading amongst the G7? How are we compared to our industrial competitors? The standard you set yourself is how close are you to what the science requires for emissions cuts? And when you look at consumption emissions against that standard, not very far up. So that's why she'll say things like it's all blah, blah, blah. She does her job, which is to call out what she would see as the bullshit. But she's quite right to say if you look at impact and footprint, and then even more if you start to look at the footprint of the City of London, then the cuts that we've got in our territorial emissions don't look anything like quite so impressive.
Okay, Simon, did you want to respond on those points?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on Michael's question about how do we cope with this rise in energy prices, and totally agree with Doug. For the less able to pay, it's going to have to be subsidy from governments supported by taxpayer funding, undoubtedly true. But personally, Michael, I think organisations like yours involved in the smarter energy system have got a massive role to play. We're still running effectively a 1950s energy system for a 21st century problem. Yeah. And we've got to get it modernised, and that means all the things you are working on, half-hour metering settlement, complete the smart meter rollout, time of use tariffs, and. Personally, I'm quite optimistic that electric vehicles can change the dynamic for a lot of people as they move into electric vehicles with energy, and your agile tariff becomes your side purchase off your electric vehicle lease. I think that could change the dynamic for a lot of people. But we have got to the first thing to do is just to have a proper policy on energy efficiency, and it is the graveyard area of energy policy. And Green Homes Grant goes on the bonfire along with, zero carbon homes, Green Deal, and. Another thing I'm looking for in the spending review is some clarity about that long-term framework on energy efficiency, because that surely has to be the starting point.
I also think on the expenditure, as well as I completely agree that those who can't pay have got to receive some, but I actually just don't think the government should make people pay more for things simply than they're incurring through bad luck. I don't have a well-insulated, energy-efficient flat because I'm virtuous. It's because it turns out that within the very limited price bracket of flats we were able to afford in London, our flat happens to be well-insulated, and I have a societal benefit from people who are in remote areas or who can get heat pumps, who do incur all of these other costs, whether they are households or businesses bearing some of that cost. So I do think, to come back to that question right at the start of, who's responsible for this, households, businesses, the government, well, we do all ultimately benefit from this transition. Some people, through no fault of their own, are going to incur greater costs and inconveniences, and I do think there does have to be some pooling of those costs and inconveniences, not least because otherwise you don't get prolonged political consent for it.
Okay. Any more questions from the room? No. So I'll go to the ones that are coming through online. So there's a question from David. Can we get to net zero without nuclear energy? And if not, how can we detoxify its image? So we haven't covered nuclear yet. And then the other question that's come through is from Richard: how can we promote more transparency and awareness about ESG investing? So in terms of perhaps nuclear energy, would either perhaps Doug or
well, I mean, on
yeah.
nuclear, I'd say yes, you can. I think the bones of what such a system would look like are now evident. That there is a okay. One of the things that I get quite frustrated about is that whatever happens, we're going to need shed loads of renewable energy. So let's just back off from nuclear for a moment. I'll come back to it. We're going to need shed loads of renewable energy. We're going to need shed loads of solar, of onshore wind, of offshore wind. And it's not about the nice stories that you can tell about jobs, although they're terribly important for getting the sort of political dissent we're talking about. But in the end, it's about the numbers. You've got to get the gigawatts deployed. And we're not doing that with anything like the sense of urgency that I think we need to do. The 40 gigawatt target that Boris Johnson announced a year ago was at this conference, that sort of pledging that. It's a big target, and it may not be enough. And that's scary, because it's already pretty damn challenging. But if you look at how fast we need to generate power for all the different uses and the things that we might want to do with it, and the fact that it's rapidly deployable, and the first nuclear power station the next nuclear power station on the block is only going to be deployed in 2034, I think is EDF's estimate. Nuclear is no short-term fix, and we've got some very, very challenging short-term targets where speed and scale is going to be crucial. Now, accompanying with that, we can now see the next gold rush. It's like, a couple of years ago it was lithium-ion batteries. The next international gold rush is on green hydrogen, and just like with lithium-ion batteries and even wind before that, people who are frankly not converts to the cause of climate change, but are just businessmen looking to make a quick buck. Not so quick in this case, but are rushing into it and putting steadily increasing levels of money into green hydrogen. And we have the offshore wind resource that is the envy of the world, because we can deploy quite a lot quite quickly, relatively. And that could be the bedrock of a system where you do have interseasonal storage, where you can accommodate these periods of very low wind speed. Now, there are some calculations to be done about, how much do you need and how much, how many electrolyzers to produce this green hydrogen do you need. But the basic proposition that it is possible to do that, I don't think is any more in dispute. I think it is. It is feasible. The question is things like, how much cost is it? How much risk do you want to take? Now, if you're in my position where I think, actually, I think nuclear power is a bad idea for all sorts of reasons, not just to do with waste and discharges, but to do with signalling to the international community, the potential haves and have-nots associated with which technologies are available to which nations, and the link to nuclear weapons, which is not really present here but is clearly present in other countries. If you're in that camp, then you say, well, I think those potential risks and potential costs, which won't be massive, but they might be there, or they might not be there, we don't know. It's worth not going down that route. So I know that's not a widely shared view. I know it's not a widely shared view amongst the cabinet, judging by some stories we've had today. But nothing that has come in terms of new technology and so on in recent years has given me any reason to doubt that I'm right.
Thank you, Doug. Stephen, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously completely defer to Doug on the science, but I think I would just say, in terms of the controversy about this, right? Actually, let's imagine for a moment, I also just completely agree, but let's for a moment imagine we're both wrong, and then new nuclear is part of the solution. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, it's really easy. The government has a majority of 86. Just do it. I don't know if people noticed, but Margaret Thatcher was re-elected multiple times while building the first generation of these power stations, right? And it's not, candidly, it's not like people jump up for joy when onshore wind farms come into their area. Actually, one of the things that, there's lots that we should be proud of for the last decade, but actually one of the things the Conservative Party should be ashamed of is that since the Liberal Democrats left the coalition, this kind of, oh no, some people might get mildly angry with the party in a council election if we will to onshore wind. It's just not, that's not a serious way for a political party to behave. And this is none of these new modes. Like, power stations aren't popular when they are being built, regardless of the relative safety of them. People complain about onshore wind, they complain about solar panels, they complain about power stations. Yes, it is frustrating, I think, for many of us that in the 90s it was harder to build nuclear power stations, which, if they go wrong, might do something catastrophic, as opposed to coal power stations, which, if they go right, definitely will destroy life on this earth as we know it. But I think there's a danger sometimes that that we can be, in the Green movement, so keen to sort of continue to win that fight over why it would have been better if we had moved to nuclear earlier, that we kind of ignore, then we're perhaps not in that place anymore, and then really the only way to overcome the controversy about this stuff is just to build it, and just to take the short term, just to lose a couple of council seats in Cornwall to the Lib Dems. Worse things happen at sea.
Simon, did you want to comment on that or the ESG question as well?
Well, just briefly on nuclear, I totally agree with Doug. It's not an answer to the short-term problems. You can make the case, I think, from the volume of low-carbon electricity we're going to need. But for goodness sake, let's not have first of a kind every time, because that's what we're doing in this country. We had first of a kind in the 1980s. We did Hinkley, and now we're risking doing it all over again. If you're going to do it, then do it as a programme and stick with the programme to get the cost down. On ESG reporting, I think it's just coming. I think the bottom-up pressure from investors and consumers is just growing all the time. As a company, KPMG has just published its plan, its ESG plan, which commits to net zero by 2030, amongst other things. I think that pressure is growing on companies, certainly in this part of the world.
Yeah, okay. I've got another question from online as well, but just going back to something Gareth mentioned, and the question relates to data and maybe whether we don't have enough data. He mentioned in relation to cement, how do we make that cleaner? And I guess there's a question around concrete and steel measurement of carbon. But a similar question, more on the consumer side, would be food labelling. Do you think we should be having carbon labelling of our food products so that we know what the air miles are associated with that? Just a few sort of questions there around whether we as consumers could do more if we just knew more or had access to data on that front. And the question that's come in is slightly different. So it's from Amy. It's, is there a risk that policies like EVs and retrofits get dragged into the culture wars? If so, how can we avoid these issues being politicised? So two quite different questions there. I will leave you to interpret them accordingly. Doug, do you want to go first?
Well, just on food labelling, I mean, so I may be a bit retro on this, but if you're going to do all the analysis to allow you to do a reasonably accurate food label, actually the worthwhile thing in that is that people, generally supermarkets, are understanding their supply chain better. It's not because consumer choice is driving the change. I mean, I think the stats are something like only 50% of people look at the price when they're buying stuff. Only 2% of people look at the label. And so how many of those people are actually going to look at the carbon label? So I am a little sceptical about that kind of consumer labelling actually driving change. I think it can act as a kind of reputational issue, which for your Asda or your Tesco make them think, oh, what's going on in my supply chain? Why is that so high? And that, I think is a really, really useful and valuable thing to do. But just sticking something on a food product is perhaps not so much. I mean, we know broadly the areas where we've got high emissions, and that's meat and dairy and cheese. And if you're in a plant-based world, your emissions are going to be lower, almost invariably. And I don't think an enormous amount of effort put into food labelling for the consumer is really going to pay back very much, bluntly. Which is not to say it's bad, you know, if people could do it easily, it's fine, but let's not exaggerate what impact it's going to have.
Okay. Simon, Stephen, did you want to comment on either of those? The second one was the EVs and the retrofitting challenges that have come out.
Well, I think it's very important that we do have solutions for all parts of society. We can't just have, you know, those that can going off and buying their EV and getting their heat pump. We've clearly got to have solutions. The phrase was used, just transition. We've got to have a solution that works for everybody. So, yes, I mean, I very much agree. We've got to avoid that division between those that can and those that can't afford the transition.
Yeah, I actually think the answer to both these questions is the same, right? Which is, I completely agree that there is a frankly minimal benefit to labelling, and one of the reasons why there is a frankly minimal benefit is if I am someone who is working 2 jobs and I have to, you know, feed my kids before going out to my second job, I am just buying the affordable options in the supermarket. And actually, even if I am, you know, some tote bag loving Stoke Newington based ethical consumer like myself, right, I am taking an awful lot on trust that when Tony's Chocolovely tells me that it is slavery free, then they are telling the truth, right? Because I can't, every time I buy a bar of chocolate, launch an investigation into supply chains. That is not a reasonable thing to ask individual consumers to do. That is something that, and it's also actually not reasonable to ask businesses to go like, okay, look, we're going to set a minimum standard, but really you need to be here for us to meet these targets. And if you get undercut in this mid-stage, well, life's hard. And I think in terms of avoiding it getting sucked into this cultural war stuff, it's also about making sure that what we are asking of people is reasonable and fair. And I think that is the thing. It has to be about what's this project we're embarked upon, how are we making sure it's reasonable and fair. And yeah, I mean, I like I say, I love ethical consumption just as much as, yeah, in my case in second, it very much is the next person. But yeah, just as much as the next person in my leafy enclave. But it's not a viable mass solution.
Okay, any more questions from the floor? No? So there are a couple of other things that I want to draw in. Simon, you mentioned carbon capture, utilisation and storage. I wondered if you could go into a little bit more about what the UK's position is on that front and why I think there are 44 around the world and none in the UK. What do we need to do to accelerate that and what sort of impact could it have in our transition? And the second one is around homes and EPCs. So if we have to be over rating of EPC or better in a fairly short order, where are we on that journey? And frankly, how are we going to bring thousands of homes to the standard that they're required, particularly where some of those occupants are not the ones that are best placed to support that change? Perhaps on the carbon storage side, I could go to you first, Simon.
Yeah, well, carbon capture and storage is an absolutely essential part of us getting to net zero. Government's got a plan to have 4 clusters up and running by 2030, and I'm hoping we're going to hear in the next few weeks which are the first 2 to go, or 3 maybe. Maybe you're right, maybe they'll spread the jam. I hope they don't spread the jam too thinly that they don't manage to get anything moving. That's my only worry. You know, we need to make a start, and we need to make a start somewhere. We've had 2 failed attempts at CCS in this country. I see some people in the audience who were involved in those. We've got to make it 3rd time lucky for CCS in the UK.
Oh, okay. Doug, did you want to comment on either that or the sort of the EPC side of things?
Well, the question around EPC, slightly tangentially, I want to pick up on a point that Simon made at the beginning, which is whether we're institutionally configured for doing this stuff. And the job of making sure every house is up to scratch, I mean, who would be responsible for that? And who would ensure that it was done appropriately? And then you couple that with the challenges of delivering heat and network upgrades. And all of those problems are fundamentally local in nature. You can't do them from Whitehall. And I think the excessively centralised nature of the British state is going to run into some real difficulties in a lot of the delivery agenda. So we know we've made a lot of progress on electricity, and that's really good, and we have been genuinely a world leader in that. The great thing about electricity is we have a national network. The national grid gathers up all the demand, and it gathers up all the supply for us. And we can't do that with heat because you can't move it very far. And when we go very decentralized in terms of these big demands, you can't do that from a national level either, and you can't do it with building infrastructure. It's too difficult. So somewhere along the line, we're going to need, I think, at least 2 innovations to deliver EPC monitoring effectively across the country. One is we're going to need an agency, and I know people hate creating agencies, but that is properly expert in the delivery of energy efficiency. We've called it a warm homes agency, because there are quite a few things that have to happen around efficiency and heat pumps. One is, effectiveness of consumer journey, consumer protection, standards of performance. We've got to have some people who understand it, who are capable of helping and supporting supply chain expansion in the UK. There are all these things that are really quite specialist if we're going to do it properly. The other thing is I think we need to support and empower local authorities to be able to deliver some of this stuff. Unfortunately, I see fundamentally quite a lot of mistrust of local authorities to spend money well. Now, historically, you can probably point at reasons why that's true, but the reaction under all governments actually has been to centralise more, not to say, okay, let's help you do this better. And that is what, I can articulate all the policies about what needs to happen in the spending review, and what needs to happen at COP, and what needs to happen in the policies in the heat and building strategy. But the thing that always niggles in my mind is the British state, as it is currently constituted, capable of delivering this transition? And uncomfortably, I think the answer at the moment is no, it isn't. And it needs to think differently about power and about the way resources are distributed to allow us to do it. And it's kind of on nobody's agenda because it's all too conceptual. But it is underlying the next phase that we have to go through as most of the low-hanging fruit have been taken out, as we go right into people's lives in transport and heat and buildings. And we need to do things differently from how we've done them before.
Some very poignant observations there. Thank you. Simon, did you want to comment as well?
Well, I'm finding myself agreeing with Doug rather a lot this afternoon, which is it makes a change from previous panels, Doug. But I do think, I was on the CBI Heat Commission last year. We recommended a very similar body, Doug. I mean, it had a different name. It had the National Delivery Body. You need a central agency that is there to provide the expertise to the 650 local authorities, because otherwise they're all going to try and create it, and that would be daft. Whereas if you've got one expert body that can provide that insight and expertise to the local authorities, who are resource strapped anyway, so they don't have the resources. And then politically, I don't really understand this, and maybe it shows I don't perhaps understand the workings here, but the Prime Minister's keen to say he's not responsible for what goes on the shelves. Well, he's not responsible for whether it's a hydrogen or a heat pump solution in Acacia Avenue either. I mean, and that should be clearly devolved down to the lowest possible level. So provide the central expert body and then devolve the responsibility to a local level. I totally agree with you, Doug.
Stephen, did you want to comment on that?
No, I mean, this is where, the lessons of austerity are actually perversely quite useful here, right? One of the ways the Conservatives were able to deliver those very painful cuts, and we can obviously have a variety of views about whether or not they were in fact necessary, was by devolving quite a large proportion of them. And there is an obvious lesson there, and there is, I think, clearly having more agencies which help local councils deliver excellence, rather than going, oh, you probably can't do that right now, so let's not bother, because obviously we are never going to have a situation where the relevant department in Whitehall can deliver the correct home solution for Harrogate, Harlow, and Hackney, and also, you know, do all of the other stuff central government has to do. So it obviously has to involve a significant degree of devolution, and it does have to therefore involve, kind of some reworking of how the state operates and behaves, and that of course is a very long-running British disease. I mean, actually, another thing that Conservatives can genuinely say they have done is they have been willing to devolve quite a lot of power. That agenda does appear to have hit the skids a little bit, but it is, you know, a positive feather in the party's cap.
Okay, thank you. So we're coming to a close now. One final question is if I could ask the panel to each comment in terms of one policy or intervention, if they were to choose to support the transition towards net zero, what would it be? What would be on your wish list today? Doug, do you want to?
25 billion in the spending per year in the spending review. I mentioned at the beginning, it's a lot of money, but it's the sort of scale we need. And we've talked a lot about heat pumps and energy efficiency. It doesn't actually matter what your 2030 targets are at the moment if you don't grow the supply chain, the industries, the skill levels over the next few years. You're not going to hit them. Those targets are simply not going to be hit, and with it goes quite a big chunk of the 2030 target that we now have internationally committed to. So we need, you know, quite a lot of cash quite soon to get this stuff going. And, you know, this spending review is over 3 years. If we don't get it going soon, you can't repair that in 2027 and 2028. It's going to be too late. So that's the big thing. There is a lot around policy design because we had a Green Homes grant that was, embarrassingly bad. But if you don't have the money, it doesn't matter how clever your policy is. And and the spending review is coming up in 3 weeks' time-ish.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Doug. Stephen?
Well, I'm going to cheat and both bank the 25 billion. That is obviously the most important. But I would also add in the spending review, there does need to be an additional sum of money because economies and societies are complex organisms and we don't really know what's going to happen when we pull one lever and something happens. But there does have to be some money put aside to essentially bail out and support households, some of whom will be losers and will find this process very painful. And people cannot be left on the hook because that is how you end up with, you know, the consensus breaking down around this. So yeah, I'm going to bank the 25 billion, have an extra 8. For
8. Okay, well, it's going up. Okay.
All right, I'll bank the
Simon?
34. And then I'll double you with a very clear statement in the forthcoming heat and building strategy of when we're going to phase out gas boilers.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much for all those final comments. That brings us to the end of our transition to net zero panel. It's been a very wide-ranging discussion, I'm sure you'll agree. If you'd like to know more about Bright Blue, please speak with the team at the back about membership as well. In fact, I'm advised that we're offering £10 membership if you join during party conference. So, and our next event is back in this room in just an hour, leaving no one behind, the people's voice in levelling up with poverty solutions. So many thanks to our expert panel for joining us today, to our supporter KPMG for partnering with us, and to our guests here and online for your contributions as well. Thank you very much.